In the early 90s, Sega was at their height due to the success of the Genesis. Hits like Sonic the Hedgehog and Streets of Rage helped Sega gain a 60% market share of the industry, narrowly beating Nintendo. By 1993, Sega was preparing for their next console, the 32-bit Sega Saturn. Wanting a new game that could show its capabilities, they held an internal poll asking their employees for new concepts. One of those who participated was 23-year-old Yukio Fudetsugi, who had submitted proposals for several games. At that point, Fudetsugi had been working at Sega for 2 years, assisting with 2 games such as Shinobi for the Game Gear. Sega had liked his proposal for a 3D shooter, and in January of 1994 they made him lead of the recently formed Team Andromeda, a subsidiary of Sega's Consumer Research and Development Department. The team consisted of 15 people, including illustrator and character designer Manabu Kusunoki, and producers Yoji Ishii and Tomohiro Kondo. During initial planning, the team came up with the idea of having the player control a dragon as opposed to a spaceship. They felt the concept was a more original idea, and more organic movements could show the capabilities of the hardware. The style and aesthetics of the world were also inspired by Ottoman and Turkish architecture. Fudetsugi also began writing the story, inspired by the post-apocalyptic sci-fi and fantasy settings of anime literature such as Nausicaa the Valley of the Wind, Dune, Azrak, and The Long Afternoon on Earth. He developed an elaborate backstory for the world, going so far as to create a new language that mixed Latin, Ancient Greek, and Russian that fans have dubbed Panzerese. The game also drew inspirations from contemporaries such as Space Harrier, Star Fox, Rayforce, and Starblade. Development on Panzer Dragoon went through much adversity. This was due to the complexity of the Saturn's architecture and Team Andromeda's lack of experience with the hardware, which was still in development when production began. These setbacks caused them to miss the Japan launch of the Saturn in November 1994. Initially, it had to be developed on hypothetical hardware using Soft Image 3D and SGI workstations. They also developed their own mapping tools and graphics library. The team weren't sure how far they could push the hardware, so to get around this, they adopted a new design philosophy of keeping things simple. This meant everything from levels and objects had to be designed in a way that was easy for players to recognize and for the developers to create. By the time they received a debug unit in mid-1994, the team were able to iron out any bugs and lock the game at 20 frames per second. Despite its setbacks, Team Andromeda and Sega were confident about the project, and development finished by the end of the year. The last few months before release, composer Yoshitaka Azuma began working on the soundtrack, which consisted of orchestral and electronic pieces. This was also his first game. Previously, he had released several electronic albums in the 80s and had done music for the NHK. On March 10, 1995, the game was launched in Japan. North American gamers thought they had to wait until September. However, at that year's E3 on May 11th, Sega announced that the Saturn and 5 titles, including Panzer Dragoon, would launch that very day, much to the annoyance of publishers and retailers who weren't notified of the change. Europe had to wait almost 2 months later, on August 30th. Panzer Dragoon takes place thousands of years after all advanced civilization was destroyed during a great war between humans and bioweapons. The remaining humans splintered off into tribes and smaller nations. Of these nations, no one was more powerful than the Empire, whose military might was unmatched. Over the years, the Empire began discovering ancient artifacts and weapons, including a mysterious ancient tower in the middle of the sea. One day, after being dormant for many years, the tower suddenly reactivated, announcing the coming of Units 1 and 2. The game follows a hunter after he was separated from his party during an attack by sand creatures called burrowers. Though he was nameless in the North American and European versions, he was called Kyle Fluge in the Japanese release. Kyle fled to a nearby cave which housed an ancient hangar. There he found himself in the middle of a battle between 2 dragons. During the skirmish, the blue dragon's rider was fatally wounded, and in his final moments the rider asked Kyle to take his dragon and stop the black dragon from reaching the tower. The gameplay was similar to other shooters, but had an interesting twist. While the dragon flew in one direction, pressing either L or R let you change between 4 different views, giving the player 360 degrees of aiming. This also meant enemies would come from all directions, with a mini-map at the upper right-hand corner showing where enemies were and which direction you were facing. Tapping either A, B, or C would fire your weapon. Holding down either one of them would let you charge and aim a powerful homing laser at multiple enemies. Pressing X, Y, or Z also changed the camera zoom. Despite its difficulty, there were no health pickups throughout the game. Instead, your health would partially recharge at the end of each episode. The game spans 6 episodes, starting at the submerged city and continuing through a desert wasteland, imperial mines, ancient ruins, vast forests, and the imperial city overrun with pure types, ending in a final confrontation with the Black Dragon. Each episode ended with a boss and a percentage of how many enemies you killed. Upon defeating the Black Dragon, Kyle and the Blue Dragon headed into the tower. Knowing what lied ahead, the dragon summoned a force field around Kyle and left him behind while heading deeper into the complex. It then fired a homing laser, causing the tower to emit a blinding light. When he awakened, Kyle found himself in the middle of a desert. As he searched for the dragon, he took notice that surrounding him was its footprints. Kyle then looked into the sky, unsure if it had survived. Upon completing the game, you were ranked depending on your percentage in each level. Getting more than 90% granted you the highest rank of Dragoon. If you beat the game on hard, you would get an extra ending with a code to unlock Wizard Mode, which made the gameplay much faster. During the end credits, a series of paintings by Ryuichiro Katsuzawa were displayed, chronicling Kyle's journey. Panzer Dragoon was a surprise success, selling more than 167,000 units in its first week in Japan. Initially, the game had been given very little coverage in the US, however, that all changed after Sega's E3 surprise launch of the Saturn. Critics praised Panzer Dragoon for its gameplay, graphics, and soundtrack, though some criticism was aimed at its simple story and lack of diverse weapons. The game has received high ratings from many publications and was considered a must-have for the Saturn. 2 years after its release, the game was ported over to PC by Expert Software. The port added a higher resolution and better lighting. The original PC port was also released on the Xbox as an unlockable in Panzer Dragoon Orta. To obtain it, you need to either beat the game or log in 5 hours of gameplay. In 2006, it was remastered for the PS2 under the Sega Aegis 2500 brand. This version differed greatly from the PC, as it included both the Saturn version and a new arranged mode, with better textures, new 3D models, anti-aliasing, and unlockable extras. More recently, Forever Entertainment announced they were partnering with Sega to develop a full remake. It was released on the Nintendo Switch on March 26, 2020, with plans for later release on Windows and Stadia later that year. The remake stayed close to the original while completely revamping the graphics and adding new control options. Panzer Dragoon ended up selling 370,000 units worldwide. Despite its critical and commercial success, it didn't perform as well as Sega had hoped. However, it was enough to warrant a sequel. Team Andromeda immediately began work on not 1, but 2 follow-ups. This was only the beginning of a new series. This has been part 1 of the 6-part Panzer Dragoon retrospective. In the upcoming parts, we'll be covering the 3 sequels, Zwei, Saga, and Orta, 2 spin-offs, 1 anime OVA, and a look at the world of Panzer Dragoon and the people behind it.